Deputy Adjutant General, South Africa, Rorke's Drift, February 21st, 1879. Sir, I have the honor to report that on the 22nd of January last, when the camp of Isandlwana was attacked by the enemy, the Queen's colour of the 1st Battalion 24th Regiment was in the camp, the headquarters and 5 companies of the regiment being there also. From all the information I have been since able to obtain, it would appear that when the enemy had got into camp, and when there was no longer hope left of saving it, the adjutant of the 124th Regiment, Lieutenant Teignmouth Melville, departed from the camp on horseback, carrying the colour with him, in hope of being able to save it. The only road to Rorke's Drift, already being in the possession of the enemy, Lieutenant Melville and the few others who still remained alive struck across country for the Buffalo River, which it was necessary to cross to reach a point of safety. In taking this line, the only one possible ground had to be gone over, which, from its ruggedness and precipitous nature, would, under ordinary circumstances, it is reported, be deemed almost utterly impassable for mounted men. During a distance of about 6 miles, Lieutenant Melville and his companions were closely pursued, or more properly speaking, accompanied by a large number of the enemy, who, from their well-known agility in getting over rough ground, were able to keep up with our people, though the latter were mounted, so that the enemy kept up a constant fire on them, and sometimes even got close enough to assegai the men and horses. Lieutenant Melville reached the bank of the Buffalo and at once plunged in, horse and all. But being encumbered with the colour, which is an awkward thing to carry even on foot, and the river being full and running rapidly, he appears to have got separated from his horse when he was about halfway across. He still, however, held on resolutely to the colour and was being carried off downstream when he was washed against a large rock in the middle of the river. Lieutenant Higginson, of the native contingent, who had also lost his horse in the river, was clinging to this rock, and Melville called to him to lay hold of the colour. This Lieutenant Higginson did, but the current was so strong that both officers with the colour were again washed away into still water. In the meantime, Lieutenant Coghill, 124th Regiment, my orderly officer, who had been in camp that morning when the main body of the force moved out, on account of a severe injury to his knee, which rendered him unable to move without assistance, had also succeeded in gaining the river's bank in company with Lieutenant Melville. He too had plunged at once into the river. His horse had carried him safely across, but on looking round for Lieutenant Melville and seeing him struggling to save the colour in the river, he at once turned his horse and rode back into the stream again to Lieutenant Melville's assistance. It would appear that now the enemy had assembled in considerable force along their own bank and had opened a heavy fire on our people, directing it more especially on Lieutenant Melville, who wore a red patrol jacket, so that when Lieutenant Coghill got into the river again, his horse was almost immediately killed by a bullet. Lieutenant Coghill was thus cast loose in the stream also, and notwithstanding the exertions of both these gallant officers, the colour was carried off from them, and they themselves gained the bank in a state of extreme exhaustion. It would appear that they now attempted to move up the hill from the riverbank towards Helpmacar, but must have been too much exhausted to go on, as they were seen to sit down to rest again. This, I sorely regret to say, was the last time these two most gallant officers were seen alive. It was not for some days after the 22nd that I could gather any information as to the probable fate of these officers, but immediately I discovered in what direction those who had escaped from Isandlwana had crossed the Buffalo. I sent, under Major Black, 224th Regiment, a mounted party who volunteered for this service to search for any trace that could be found of them. This search was successful, and both bodies were found where they were last seen. Several dead bodies of the enemy were found about there, so that they must have sold their lives dearly at the last. As it was considered that the dead weight of the colour would cause it to sink in the river, it was hoped that a diligent search in the locality where the bodies of these officers were found might lead to its recovery. So Major Black again proceeded on the 4th to prosecute this search. His energetic efforts were, I am glad to say, crowned with success, and the colour with the ornaments, case, etc. belonging to it were found, though in a different place, in the riverbed. I cannot conclude this report without drawing the attention of H.E., the Lieutenant General commanding, in the most impressive manner which words can command, to the noble and heroic conduct of Lieutenant Adjutant Melville, who did not hesitate to encumber himself with the colour of the regiment in his resolve to save it at a time when the camp was in the hands of the enemy, and its gallant defenders rallied to the last man in its defence, and when there appeared but little prospect that any exertions Lieutenant Melville would make would enable him to save even his own life. Also, later on, to the noble perseverance with which, when struggling between life and death in the river, his chief thoughts to the last were bent on the saving of the colour. Similarly, would I draw His Excellency's attention to the equally noble and gallant conduct of Lieutenant Coghill, who did not hesitate for an instant to return, unsolicited, and ride again into the river under heavy fire of the enemy to the assistance of his friend, though at the time he was wholly incapacitated from walking, and but too well aware that any accident that might separate him from his horse must be fatal to him. In conclusion, I would add that both these officers gave up their lives in the truly noble task of endeavouring to save from the enemy's hands the Queen's colour of their regiment. And greatly though their sad end is to be deplored, their deaths could not have been more noble or more full of honour. I have the honour to be, Sir, your obedient servant, Colonel R. Glyn, commanding 3rd Column.